Hello, this is your host, Austin Hopkins, and welcome to the Introvert Leader Podcast. Hello, and welcome to episode 3, ADHD at Work. Really happy to have you guys here for another episode, and we're going to jump right in, folks. So personally, a couple things that have been going on in my world. One, I got to tell you about my golden retriever. So she's 1 year old. Her name's Lady, as I shared before, and she started this new kind of cool routine where she takes her dirtiest toy, the one that's been outside in the dirt and the mud, and she brings it up and puts it right on my pillow. So right as I get into bed, I get to enjoy that. So that's been really, really fun. Honestly, golden retrievers are still kind of cracking me up on how spazzy and weird they are. We love her, but I mean, I swear every day is an interesting new little thing we're learning about her. But outside of the dogs, recently it's all been coffee. So I was lucky to go to Brooklyn a couple weeks ago and check out a new place called Devotion Coffee. And essentially their claim to fame, if you will, is they're the freshest coffee out there. So from what I remember reading, the coffee is roasted, picked, and all served within 10 days, which is kind of weird to think that you can get coffee from across the world. It's picked, it's prepared, and you're sipping it inside of 2 weeks. So I got to say it was amazing coffee. And pro tip for all of you coffee drinkers out there, if you're not buying fresh, unground coffee, you're missing out, folks. That's just the truth. So why talk about ADHD at work? Why devote a whole episode to that? And the answer is pretty simple. I have ADHD and I'm not alone. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, I think roughly 4.4% of US adults have ADHD. I would say the chances are that you probably know someone who has ADHD or you have it. And I figure, hearing from my perspective may be interesting, right? Because I guess I haven't necessarily had the most traditional experience with it. And so we'll get into kind of what it was like to get diagnosed for me. What are some of the, advantages, disadvantages, what it looks like to work with ADD or ADHD. You might hear me slip and call it ADD because I guess over the last few years, they've actually kind of gotten rid of that term ADD, and it's now all under the umbrella of ADHD. But, I think most importantly, there's a little misunderstanding of what, ADHD in adults looks like and how it can affect your career. So I'll tell you a little story about kind of how it started with me. So I have a story that kind of illustrates what it was like having ADD or ADHD as a kid. So I remember sitting downstairs in my parents' house, bottom floor of the house growing up, and, it would be the end of the night. I needed to do some schoolwork. And I remember I would sit at this little desk we have, this little wooden desk, and I would just sit there and stare at the wall. And it felt like it would be 2 to 4 hours every night of me literally just staring at the wall or at my homework. I needed to do the homework. I knew that. I knew I had to do it, but for the life of me, I could not get myself to focus. And I remember thinking, this was my first experience with ADHD. And at the time, I probably didn't even know that this wasn't normal, right? I thought, I'm sure all my friends don't want to do their homework, but, it wasn't until 19 did I actually finally go see a doctor and get diagnosed. And sure enough, goes through the tests and was able to pretty clearly see that, I had some symptoms and I was dealing with ADD or ADHD, as they say. And, for me, it was interesting not being diagnosed, right? Because in school, I was characterized as disruptive or, just couldn't focus, too much emphasis on talking with friends or whatever it may look like. And, I thought that was just behavioral issues, right? That's what my parents thought. They just thought maybe he's kind of going through some issues. Maybe he'll grow out of it, but I didn't, right? So, as you guys heard in the last episode, school was so tough for me that I ended up dropping out. So obviously went through that whole experience, got diagnosed. But, I talk with people all the time who had a very similar experience, right? Their kids either were never diagnosed or they weren't diagnosed. They think they may have ADHD. And I hear about the struggles that they go through. And for the parents out there, I think firsthand the struggles that your kids go through, right? And the struggles you may have as a parent, right? Do I medicate? Is this going to be a phase? Is there anything I can do to help them? Do we need to hire a tutor? Whatever it may look like. I know that can be challenging. I remember thinking about this a couple weeks ago when I was doing kind of the planning for this episode and thinking about the struggles that my parents went through, right? Because at the end of the day, you want your kids to be successful. And even the person with the ADHD wants to be successful, but there's just something kind of getting in the way. So, I can't sit here and say that I have, the playbook, the one size fits all approach that will fix this, that will help you be successful in your career. But what I can do is share a little bit about my experience with it over the last 13 years. So I think first and foremost, it's probably important to start with, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of ADHD? And I think for those of you who don't have it, some of these might be new information, but for those of you who do have ADHD, this won't come as a surprise, but more of just a reassurance that you're not alone. So the first one, let's start with the disadvantages. So number one, for me personally, I am easily distracted. I have the hardest time staying focused on a specific task. Now, if it's a task I care about, that may be a different story. We'll talk about that later. But if it's just a regular task, maybe it's a task at work, maybe it's a task at home, whatever it may be, I have a really hard time staying focused. I get distracted easily. And so, the littlest thing can distract me. A song pops on the radio, boom, I'm distracted. Now I'm thinking about music. I'm hungry. Great. Now I'm thinking about what we're going to make for dinner. Whatever it is, super distracted. And that can be honestly really, really challenging. And then I would say the other one that really is a big disadvantage for me personally is organization. Because I had trouble focusing and remembering things, my organization suffered, right? So, deadlines might get missed. I would show up late to places. I would just have trouble keeping things in their right place, things that needed to be a repeatable process, right? Something that was important, I just couldn't do. I would just forget to get organized or would have the best intentions to be organized and just kind of fail. So I would say those are the two biggest disadvantages with ADD, at least for me personally. But I think there's some interesting advantages also. So the two biggest advantages that really come out to, stand out to me is number one is hyperfocus. So what do I mean by that? Hyperfocus, how I see it and how it's been for me, is it's the ability to have intense focus that can lead to a really high quality output, right? So if there's something that I deem important, something that I know I need to focus on, I can put my head down and work for hours on hours without even looking up and seeing what else is going on. I'm so stinking focused on whatever the task is. It's almost like nothing else exists, right? And, I'm not a big sports person, but I've seen my share of sports movies and they kind of talk about being in the zone, right? And how when you're in the zone, the crowd gets quiet. You don't even realize anyone's there. You're just focused on what you need to do. That's kind of what I would relate it to for me. It's that intense focus that allowed me to just really nail down the details and make sure that I was producing some high quality stuff. So, I would say when you have that hyper focus on something that's important to you, the details start becoming important, right? So now I'm not forgetting the details. I'm able to get done what I need to get done. And, I'll give you an example of this hyper focus. So a few years back, I was working at a company and we were going to be launching a new tool. And this was a tool that was new to the organization. And I personally hadn't had much experience in launching a tool like this. But this was a big project. And I knew I wanted to be successful. And it was important to me, right? Because this is something that was going to take me out of my comfort zone and allow me to do something bigger, better. And so I remember the project and how much was needed. And there was details, right? There was UAT testing that was needed. There was stakeholder management that was important. There was communication plans. There was written resources that we needed to create, right? So lots of detailed, important tasks that needed to happen. And because I was so interested and I guess motivated for this project, those details and those tasks became easy. I was able to sit down, at the end of a workday and spend 3 to 4 hours on all of the things that I needed to get done. And that focus was actually incredibly important because it allowed me to really make sure that this high visibility tool, was launched successfully, right? And the details were important because this tool was going to be used by hundreds of teammates. So I tell you that story to say, hey, there can be some advantages, right, of that hyper focus, but the key becomes, how do you get yourself to focus on maybe things that you think are important, but that aren't necessarily the most exciting, which we'll get into in a minute. I think another advantage of ADHD is the spontaneity. So I believe that because I sometimes have trouble focusing, right, and sometimes I have trouble staying on task, new ideas, new things pop into my head. So this kind of leads to flexibility, if you will, versus that rigidness, right? Because I'm not necessarily only focused on one thing and that's all that matters. I'm open to new ideas. So somebody has a new idea, right? I'm willing to take a shot on that, take a flyer on that and see what happens. I think another kind of advantage of that spontaneity is that it allows for creative risks, right? Because I'm not necessarily sold on one path and I'm open to whatever else comes my way, whatever my team comes up with, whatever ideas pop into my head, I'm able to be creative and not necessarily stay on one path. And then also I would say the other advantage becomes, you can quickly pivot when that path that you originally chose no longer makes sense, because I'm a big proponent and big believer of changing your mind and the power in not having it all figured out and realizing that, hey, it's not only just okay to change your mind, change your perspective, but it actually shows that you're able to take in all of the information and that you're not too set in your ways, which I think is obviously something that's important for all of us. So now I talked a little bit about, the disadvantages and some of the advantages. I want to talk a little bit about what it looks like working with ADHD at the age of 19 until now, and specifically talk about my experience with medication. So I'll start by saying this. I have been on and off of ADHD medication since I was 19. And I would take it for 3 to 6 months, maybe even a year, and then I would decide to stop taking the meds. I think for me, I never really liked the idea of being like dependent on something to find success. I never really liked the idea of owing my success to something, foreign, something that wasn't naturally occurring within myself. But on the flip side of that, I really enjoyed the byproduct of the meds, right? There's a reason why pharmaceutical companies have come up with these amazing medications that do amazing things, specifically for ADHD. So, some of the benefits of that medication is when you start taking it, you have the most immense focus. It's like the weirdest thing. I could knock out any task, no matter how boring, no matter if I cared about it or not, and I would deliver solid results, right? I was organized, and details for me were easily remembered. I could recall information at ease, which was not really something that came to me before the medication. So those are some of the benefits, but some of the negative side effects, and there are some doozies for me, was number one, it kind of took away my humor. And you might think, well, is that important to you? I mean, humor, in the business world, is it that important? Well, for me, it is. In fact, you'll hear more about my perspective on humor later on. But for me, it took away my sense of humor. So I wasn't able to be in the moment and make jokes and make fun of others and myself and keep it light. I was too serious. It was almost like my personality was dimmed, if you will. I felt tense. So you might be thinking, should I take medication? Should I not take medication? And I guess for me, it really comes down to personal preference, obviously. But I will tell you a story and an example of why I ultimately chose to get off medication and why I don't necessarily see myself using medication long term. So the story takes place, I want to say maybe 5 to 7 years ago. I was working at a large commercial bank, and every 6 months, my branch would undergo an in-depth audit where the audit team would turn over every stone. They would check every little thing in the branch to make sure that, we were compliant, right? And as a branch manager, this audit was so important to my performance, right? And to my boss's performance, that a poor score could affect your entire year, right? Your total year-end review and compensation could be negatively affected if you had a bad audit. So now that you know a little bit about how important the audit is, I'll tell you this. I got to be honest, my audit results sucked for a few years. They did. They just weren't good. I had great intentions of producing a great audit, but due to the boring nature of the task, I would forget little things. And you add up enough little things, and this equaled some bad results. And obviously, this is a real problem, as you could imagine. So at some point, I decided to get back on the meds, right? I want to give it a shot and I guess see what happens. So, I knew there was an upcoming audit, and I quickly realized just how much the meds were truly helping me. Once I got back on the meds, the details that I had once forgot related to the audit now jumped out at me, right? They jumped off the page. I had structure for completing the necessary tasks. And as the audit approached, I felt confident. The day of the audit came and my team killed it. So happy to say, we achieved a solid score and I felt amazing. But a few months later, I decided to get back off the meds, right? Due to the side effects. I just didn't like how I felt. I felt like just the real Austin wasn't there, right? That it was kind of just the stripped down version of Austin, if you will. But I knew if I got off the meds, I needed a strategy to find success in the next audit, right? Because it wasn't a question of, hey, it's okay if you don't do well in the audits, you can still keep your job. That just wasn't a possibility, right? If you didn't do well in the audits, most likely you weren't going to have a career there. So around this time, luckily, I started working with a fantastic peer at my branch, just who happened to be one of the most incredibly organized, detail-oriented, and all-around hard worker you could ever imagine. And, as she was there, I could tell she was really good at preparing for audits. I mean, this girl had a process and it worked. So, I started to show more of an interest in how she approached the required tasks, how she inspected the results, how she held those around her accountable so that the whole team was bought in, right? So it wasn't just her. And, I'll forever be thankful to her for that, leadership and lessons that she taught me. Even though she wasn't necessarily my boss and more of a peer, I learned so much from her. But, sadly, as it does, time ends together, right? And so our time came to an end. But I knew I needed to take some of those lessons that I had learned from Christina and make them my own and make my own process. So I decided to create a new structure, right? I created a detailed daily, weekly, monthly, and quarterly plan to ensure I could be successful. Shared the plan with the team. I held them accountable for the success of the audit. And I also held myself accountable to my new plan, right? It's one thing to come up with a plan, but it's another thing to follow through. So the next audit came a few months later, and to my delight, my branch killed it. We achieved even a better score than the last time, almost perfect. And the experience, I guess, taught me that if you put forward the right intentions and the focus, even on the boring things, you can find success without medication. So I can't sit here and say that I don't have times where I forget things now. And I can't sit here and say that I've mastered working with ADHD without medication. But what I will say is I've come to kind of accept my limitations, and I've come to kind of accept also the advantages, right? And the strategies that I can take to be successful. So, speaking of strategies, I think there's a couple of things that people on the phone, out there in podcast world, wherever you're listening, can do to be successful. So I think the first strategy that I would take if I was struggling with ADHD and was looking for some ways to get better would be get organized. So obviously, everybody knows organization is important, but for those of you who have ADHD, you know how just important it can be if you're not organized. So for me, what I did is I discovered a tool called Trello. It's a project management tool, but it works for pretty much anything you can imagine. So I use it not only for my work career, but I also use it for my personal life. And in fact, I'm using it for this podcast. I also know that another popular one is OneNote. So if it's Trello, it's OneNote. If it's an Excel file, doesn't matter what it is, whatever tool you think works best for yourself, pick it, stick to it, and get organized. Because the more organized you are, the better you're going to be able to tackle those important tasks that come up. I think the next one is remembering information. So, you can't just sit there and snap your fingers and say, hey, I want to remember stuff better, but you can take some steps to try to be better at recalling information. And the biggest step I would take is start taking notes. So every interaction I had at work, every time I was interacting with someone that was important, or if I heard some detail that was important, I had my little black journal with me and I took some notes, right? And then I would take those notes and upload them into the Trello tool at the end of the day so that I had a clear, easy way to access them. But for me, taking notes really, really helped me remember information because you just aren't going to be able to remember it all. And then I would say the last one is around reframing things, reframing tasks. And what I mean by that is I've mentioned a couple of times how it can be kind of a challenge to remember stuff or to focus on stuff that's not important to you, but you have to be able to change your view of those seemingly unimportant tasks and reframe them as something that is important to you. And so how do you do that? For me, what I started to do is try to find how I could attach that, what I will call stupid task or unimportant task, to something that was important to me. Maybe it was a big promotion. Maybe it was a big goal I had. Maybe it was a financial goal. Maybe it was me, getting to that next job within the company. Whatever it is, I tried to tie that task into something bigger. And when I did that, I started to realize that I could reframe how I viewed it, right? And then those seemingly unimportant tasks started to become a little bit more important. So I would say those 3 strategies have worked for me. I can't sit here and say that I've mastered working with ADHD. There's going to be days where I forget stuff, even with my best intentions, even with staying organized. But these 3 things have really, really helped me and many others who I've recommended them to. So now that we've talked a little bit about kind of some of the ADHD strategies, I want to wrap up by talking about how you can use ADHD to stand out. And you might be thinking, how could I use maybe this disorder as something positive? Like, how is that even going to work? And there's 2 things that I can recommend when it comes to trying to use this as your superpower, or trying to use it to stand out is, number 1, volunteer for those projects, those tasks, those assignments that you're interested in. And then to your advantage, you can use that deep focus, right? So if there's something that you're kind of interested in, raise your hand and say you'll take it on. And you'll find that you enjoy the task and that your focus allows you to excel far more than you could imagine, because the time goes by like nothing and all of your energy, your intention is all focused on whatever the task in it is hand. So now that we've talked a little bit about the ADHD strategies and how you can kind of use those to find success, I want to wrap up by talking about how you can use ADHD to stand out. How you can use it almost as a superpower, if you will. So the first thing I would say is, for me, it's been all about volunteering for projects, tasks, and assignments that I was interested in, right? For me, I was able to use that deep focus, right? That hyper focus on projects and tasks. And I found out that because I was able to put that hyper focus on it, I was able to produce some pretty good results. And the time went by like nothing, right? You didn't even realize that you were spending all this time on it, and you produced great work because of that hyper focus. So for me, raising my hand, volunteering allows me to stand out and kind of excel on different projects or tasks. So highly recommend trying that. And then the second one for me has been around just talking about it openly. I would say for the first few years, I was kind of embarrassed about it. And I thought, geez, adults aren't supposed to have ADHD, and you're supposed to kind of grow out of that, right? But for me, obviously I didn't, and many adults still have it. But talking about it did a couple of things. One, it allowed me to not feel embarrassed about it. And number 2, I was finding that I was able to help those around me who were kind of suffering with it as well to not feel alone, right? So there's something about not feeling alone, or not feeling like you're struggling alone. So 2 things that I would do for sure would be continue to volunteer for stuff, right? Raise your hand, do things that allow you to use your hyperfocus, and then talk about it openly, right? There's always going to be an advantage of talking about kind of what makes you unique, and hopefully finding that within someone else as well. All right, now that you've heard about my experience with ADHD, being undiagnosed, some of the advantages, the disadvantages, what it's like to work with ADHD, and honestly some strategies, hopefully, that you can use to continue to find success within your career and also stand out. So now that we've covered all those topics today, what I always love to do is wrap up with a challenge. So I leave you with this. If you have ADHD, this week I want you to talk about it with one person around you. Tell them about your experience. You never know when someone out there is kind of going through the same thing and just wants to hear that others are struggling with it as well. And if you don't have ADHD, number one, count yourself lucky. But number two, if you know or work with someone who has ADHD, take an extra second this week to help them stay organized. All right, you know it's going to be something they're going to struggle with, so send them some notes after a meeting, follow up with them and give them a gentle reminder, or give them the benefit of the doubt when they make a mistake. Super excited to have you guys listen to next episode titled Humor at Work. We're going to have a really special guest on who's going to help me kind of dissect humor and its place in the workplace, right? How do you build relationships using humor? How do you get better performance? And most importantly, how do you enjoy your work? So again, thank you so much for your time, for listening in today, and make it a great day. The Introvert Leader Podcast. Subscribe for new episodes every other Wednesday.